The black ships came from the darkness between stars like giant metal beasts hunting for prey. War Commander Vexcar stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the small blue planet through the viewing screen. Earth looked so peaceful from space, with its white clouds and blue oceans. It reminded him of dozens of other worlds he had conquered for the Draconian Empire. How many ships do they have? Vexcar asked his second-in-command. Only 12, War Commander. Small vessels barely larger than our fighters. Their weapons are primitive nuclear missiles and laser cannons. They pose no threat to our fleet. Vexcar nodded. This would be another easy conquest. The Draconians had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years, crushing any species that dared resist their expansion. Their massive black warships carried enough firepower to destroy entire planets, and their armies had never lost a battle. Earth would fall just like all the others. On Luna Station, Admiral Ben Parker watched the enemy fleet through the telescope with growing fear. The alien ships were huge, each one the size of a small city. His own fleet consisted of 12 ships hastily put together from different countries on Earth. The largest was the Hughes Guardian, commanded by Captain Holly Burns. It was humanity's most advanced warship, but compared to the alien vessels, it looked like a toy. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the alien fleet," reported Communications Officer Danny Lee. "Put it through." Ben said. The voice that came through the speakers was cold and mechanical, speaking broken English with a strange accent. "People of Earth, you will surrender your planet to the Draconian Empire. You have 72 hours to respond. Any resistance will result in the destruction of your world." Ben looked around the command center at his officers. They all knew the odds were hopeless, but none of them suggested surrender. That wasn't the human way. "Get me President Davis on the secure line," Ben ordered. Within minutes, he was speaking to the leader of the United Earth Government, Ellen. Davis had been a fighter pilot before becoming president, and she understood what they were facing. "Admiral, do we have any chance of winning a direct fight?" she asked. "None at all, Madam President. Their ships are too big and too well armed. But that doesn't mean we're going to give up." "What do you have in mind?" Ben smiled grimly. "We're going to do what humans do best. We're going to fight dirty." President Davis authorized Operation Wildcard within the hour. Every nation on Earth contributed whatever they could to the defense effort. Cargo ships were converted into missile platforms. Space stations were turned into weapons. Even civilian vessels were modified to carry bombs and explosives. General Frank Thompson coordinated the defense from his bunker deep beneath the Pentagon. He had spent his career fighting enemies who had better equipment and more soldiers. The key was never to fight fair, never to do what the enemy expected. "They think we're going to line up our ships and have a nice, clean space battle," Frank told his staff. "Instead, we're going to hit them from every direction at once. We're going to use tactics they've never seen before." Dr. Kate Williams worked around the clock to decode the alien transmissions. What she discovered was both frightening and encouraging. The Draconians had conquered 14 different star systems, and every single species had fought the same way. They formed battle lines, followed military doctrine, and fought honorably. They all lost. "The aliens expect us to behave like every other species they've conquered," Kate explained to the Defense Council. "But we're not like other species. We're unpredictable. We break rules. We do things that don't make sense." Captain Holly Burns prepared her ship for what might be humanity's last battle. The Hughes Guardian was armed with the most advanced weapons Earth could build, but she knew it wouldn't be enough in a fair fight. Fortunately, she had no intention of fighting fair. "Load all missile tubes with nuclear warheads," she ordered, "and prepare the ramming charges." Her crew looked at her with surprise. Ramming charges were explosive devices designed to destroy your own ship while taking the enemy with you. It was a suicide tactic, but sometimes it was the only way to win. The 72 hours passed slowly. The alien fleet moved closer to Earth, maintaining perfect formation. Their ships were arranged in neat rows, following military patterns that had worked for 1,000 years. They expected the humans to either surrender or put up a brief, hopeless resistance. They were wrong. When the deadline expired, the Draconians received no surrender message. Instead, they found themselves under attack from every direction at once. Human ships came at them from above, below, and from the sides. Some were barely more than metal shells packed with explosives. Others were converted civilian vessels driven by volunteer crews who knew they probably wouldn't survive. The battle was chaos. Human fighters weaved between the massive alien ships, firing missiles, and then disappearing before the enemy could respond. Cargo ships loaded with nuclear bombs crashed into Draconian vessels, exploding in brilliant flashes of light. Space stations that had been secretly converted into weapons platforms opened fire from positions the aliens had never even considered. War Commander Vexcar watched in growing confusion as his perfectly organized fleet was torn apart by an enemy that seemed to have no strategy at all. The humans fought like they were insane, sacrificing their own ships to damage his. They broke every rule of military engagement, doing things that no sane commander would ever order. "How many ships have we lost?" he demanded. 12 destroyed, War Commander. 8 more heavily damaged. But we've only destroyed 3 human vessels. Vexcar stared at the tactical display in disbelief. His fleet was 3 times the size of the human force, with far superior weapons and armor. By all the rules of warfare, this should have been a simple victory. Instead, he was losing ships faster than he could count them. The humans weren't fighting like a military force. They were fighting like a swarm of angry insects, each one acting independently, each one willing to die to hurt the enemy. It was unlike anything in his 1,000 years of experience. "Order the fleet to retreat," he said finally. "We need to regroup and analyze their tactics." As the surviving Draconian ships pulled back from Earth, Admiral Ben Parker allowed himself a small smile. They had won the first battle, but he knew this was just the beginning. The aliens would be back, and next time they would be ready for human tactics. Or so they thought. Commander Joe Martinez led the boarding party through the twisted metal corridors of the captured Draconian ship. The vessel was massive, with hallways wide enough for trucks to drive through. Everything was built to intimidate, with sharp angles and dark surfaces that seemed to absorb light. "Stay alert," Joe whispered to his team. "We don't know what we're walking into." They found the alien crew in what appeared to be the bridge. The Draconians were tall, reptilian creatures with scales that shimmered like oil. But what struck Joe most was their behavior. They sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, as if they were broken machines that had stopped working. Dr. Susan Clark, the team's alien expert, approached one of the prisoners carefully. She had studied every piece of information Earth had about the Draconians, but actually seeing one was different from reading reports. "Can you understand me?" she asked in the alien language they had decoded. The Draconian turned its head slowly, as if the movement required great effort. You do not fight correctly," it said in halting English. "We cannot understand your battle patterns." Susan exchanged glances with Joe. This wasn't what they had expected. The alien seemed more confused than defeated. "What do you mean?" she asked. "All species fight with logic. They use formations. They follow rules. You fight like chaos itself. Our war computers cannot process your tactics." Back on Earth, engineer Lisa White was having her own revelations about the captured alien technology. The Draconian ships were marvels of engineering, far beyond anything humans had built. but they were also incredibly rigid in their design. "Look at this," Lisa said to her team, pointing at a control panel. "Every function has exactly one way to operate it. There are no manual overrides, no alternative methods. If something goes wrong, the ship just stops working." Lieutenant Paul Green, who was studying the alien computer systems, nodded in agreement. "Their artificial intelligence is incredibly advanced, but it's also completely inflexible. It can only respond to situations it has been programmed to handle. When it encounters something unexpected, it basically crashes." The implications were staggering. The Draconians had built their entire military around the idea that all intelligent species would behave in predictable ways. Their ships, their weapons, their tactics, everything was designed to counter logical, organized resistance. Humans, however, had never been particularly logical or organized when it came to warfare. War Commander Vex Carr paced the bridge of his flagship, trying to make sense of what had happened. His strategic computers had analyzed the battle data hundreds of times, but they couldn't find any pattern in the human attacks. The enemy had seemed to act randomly, without any coordination or planning. "Show me the attack patterns again," he ordered. The holographic display lit up, showing the positions of human ships during the battle. They moved in ways that defied all military logic. Some ships had attacked alone, others in small groups. Some had used their weapons, others had simply crashed into Draconian vessels. There was no central command structure, no unified strategy. "War Commander," his tactical officer reported, "our computers have identified over 300 different attack patterns used by the humans. None of them match any known military doctrine. Many of them appear to be improvised during the battle itself." Vex Carr felt something he had never experienced before: uncertainty. In 1,000 years of conquest, every enemy had been predictable. They might be brave, they might be skilled, but they always followed the same basic principles of warfare. The humans didn't seem to follow any principles at all. "Prepare the second wave," he ordered. "We will adapt to their chaos." But adaptation was easier said than done. The Draconian military had been built on the foundation of absolute order and predictability. Their soldiers were trained to follow orders without question. Their ships were designed to operate in perfect formation, and their tactics were based on centuries of successful conquest. Captain Nancy Roberts commanded a converted mining vessel called the Earthshaker. It wasn't a warship by any stretch of the imagination, but it was what she had to work with. Her crew consisted of former miners, dock workers, and mechanics who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission imaginable. "We're going to ram their flagship," Nancy announced to her crew. "I know it sounds crazy, but that's the point. They won't expect it because no sane military commander would ever order such a thing." Her crew nodded grimly. They all knew the odds of survival were almost zero, but they also knew that conventional tactics would never work against such a superior enemy. The second Draconian assault began 3 days later. This time, Vex Carr had reorganized his fleet to deal with human unpredictability. He spread his ships out, created multiple defensive formations, and programmed his computers to respond to chaos rather than order. It didn't work. The humans had learned from the first battle too, but unlike the Draconians, they changed their approach entirely. Instead of space combat, they focused on information warfare. Computer specialist Maria Johnson had found a way to hack into the alien communication network. "I can't steal their data," Maria explained to Admiral Parker. "Their security is too good. But I can flood their system with our data." "What kind of data?" "Everything. Music, movies, books, television shows, news broadcasts, social media posts. Basically, I can dump the entire internet into their computers." It seemed like a strange weapon, but Admiral Parker had learned to trust human ingenuity. "Do it," The effect was immediate and devastating. Draconian ships began to malfunction as their computer systems tried to process terabytes of human cultural information. Their artificial intelligence, designed to analyze military data, couldn't handle exposure to human creativity and chaos. Music videos crashed tactical computers. Comedy shows overloaded strategic planning systems. Social media posts filled with random human thoughts and emotions caused entire ship networks to shut down, but the real damage was psychological. The Draconian crews, who had lived their entire lives following strict orders and rigid patterns, were suddenly exposed to the concept of individual expression. They saw humans who created art for no practical purpose, who told jokes that served no military function, who expressed emotions that had no logical basis. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, monitoring the alien communications, watched in amazement as the Draconian fleet began to fall apart from within. Ship commanders were arguing with their superiors. Crews were questioning orders, and some vessels had simply stopped responding to commands altogether. "They're not just losing the battle," Jennifer reported. "They're losing their entire understanding of how a military force should operate. The concept of individual thought is spreading through their fleet like a virus." The second battle ended not with victory or defeat, but with confusion. The Draconian fleet retreated again, but this time, many of their ships were no longer operating as a unified force. Some had broken formation, others had stopped following orders, and a few had actually begun communicating with human vessels. War Commander Vex Carr stared at the tactical display in shock. His perfectly disciplined fleet was falling apart, and he didn't understand why. The humans hadn't just defeated his ships. They had somehow infected his crews with their chaos. For the first time in his long military career, Vexcar began to doubt everything he believed about warfare, civilization, and the nature of intelligent life itself. Dr. Alan Foster couldn't believe what he was seeing. The captured Draconian computer core was the size of a small building, filled with processing units that could think faster than any human brain. But right now, it was acting like a confused child trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "The system keeps trying to categorize human behavior," Alan explained to his research team. "It has files on every species the Draconians have conquered, with detailed patterns of how they fight, how they surrender, how they organize their societies. But when it tries to analyze humans, it just breaks." Computer specialist Maria Johnson nodded as she watched the alien data streams. "Look at this. It's trying to process a video of a human comedy show. The AI understands that humans are communicating, but it can't figure out why they're making sounds that serve no military or survival purpose." "You mean laughter?" asked Dr. Foster. "Exactly. To the Draconian mind, laughter is completely pointless. They've never encountered a species that does things just for fun." The implications were staggering. The Draconians had built their empire on the assumption that all intelligent life would behave logically and predictably. They had never met a species that created art, told jokes, or did things simply because they wanted to. Meanwhile, the third Draconian assault force was approaching Earth, but it was unlike anything they had sent before. Commander Gary Hughes, watching the alien fleet through long-range sensors, could see that something was wrong. "They're not maintaining formation," he reported to Admiral Parker. "Some ships are moving in perfect military order, but others are wandering around like they're lost." "What do you mean, wandering?" Parker asked. "I mean, they're not following any tactical pattern at all. Some have stopped moving entirely. Others are flying in circles. And a few have actually broken off from the main fleet and are heading back toward Draconian space." The truth was even stranger than the humans realized. The Draconian fleet was experiencing something unprecedented in their 1,000-year history. Individual thinking. Crews who had been exposed to human cultural transmissions were beginning to question their orders, their mission, and their entire way of life. Captain Zechthel stood on the bridge of his heavy cruiser, staring at a human. Music video playing on his tactical display. The images made no sense to him. Humans dancing and singing about love, with no apparent military purpose. But something about it fascinated him in a way he couldn't explain. "Commander," his tactical officer reported, "we're receiving orders to attack the human homeworld." Zechthel continued watching the video. The humans in it seemed ... happy. He had never seen beings express joy like that. In Draconian society, emotions were controlled, regulated, and suppressed. Individual desires were meaningless compared to the needs of the Empire. "Commander?" a tactical officer repeated. "I heard you," Zechthel said quietly. "But I'm wondering, why do we attack them? What do we gain by destroying something that creates ... this?" The tactical officer looked confused. Questions like that were forbidden in Draconian society. Orders were followed without question, without thought, without doubt. But doubt was spreading through the fleet like a plague. Ship after ship was experiencing the same crisis as their crews were exposed to human concepts of individual expression, creativity, and freedom. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, monitoring the alien communications from Earth, was documenting the collapse of an entire civilization's worldview. The Draconian language barely had words for concepts like personal choice or individual opinion, but their crews were desperately trying to express ideas they had never been allowed to have. They're trying to understand why humans create art, Jennifer reported to the Defense Council, but their language doesn't have words for beauty, creativity, or personal expression. They have to invent new terms just to describe what they're seeing. The effect was cascading through Draconian society. The cultural transmissions weren't just reaching the military fleet. They were being broadcast throughout the Empire. On planets that had been conquered centuries ago, citizens were beginning to ask questions that had never been asked before. On the Draconian homeworld, Supreme War Leader Hexmore was facing a crisis unlike anything in their recorded history. Across the Empire, people were refusing to follow orders, not out of rebellion, but out of confusion. They were asking why, instead of simply obeying. "Show me the reports," Hexmore demanded. His aide displayed a holographic map of the Empire. Red indicators showed planets where civil order was breaking down. Not from violence or revolt, but from citizens who had suddenly discovered the concept of individual thought. "The humans have somehow infected our people with their chaos," the aide reported. "Citizens are creating what they call art. They're expressing personal opinions. Some are even refusing work assignments because they want to do different jobs." Hexmore felt a chill run through his scaled body. The foundation of Draconian society was absolute obedience and conformity. If citizens started thinking for themselves, the Empire would collapse. "Cut all communication with the fleet at Earth," he ordered. "Block any transmission from human space." But it was too late. The idea of individual freedom, once introduced, was impossible to contain. It spread through the Draconian information networks like a virus, infecting every mind it touched. Back at Earth, the third battle was unlike anything anyone had expected. The Draconian fleet arrived divided and confused. Some ships attacked with their usual precision, but others simply stopped firing. A few actually began transmitting messages to the human fleet, asking questions about concepts like friendship, love, and personal choice. Captain Holly Burns found herself in the strange position of conducting a space battle while simultaneously trying to explain human emotions to alien warriors who had never experienced them. "Why do you fight for each other?" asked a Draconian ship commander in broken English. "What do you gain from protecting those who are not yourself?" Holly thought about the question seriously. It was something humans took for granted, but explaining it to a species that had never known loyalty or love was difficult. "Because we care about each other," she said finally. "We fight to protect the people we love, the places we call home, the future we want to build together." The alien commander was silent for a long moment. Then, incredibly, his ship ceased firing and withdrew from the battle. Similar scenes were playing out across the battlefield. Draconian crews were laying down their weapons, not in surrender, but in confusion. They couldn't understand why they were fighting beings who created beauty, expressed joy, and cared for each other. The battle ended not with victory or defeat, but with a mass defection. Nearly half the Draconian fleet simply stopped fighting and requested asylum at Earth. Their crews wanted to learn more about these strange concepts of individual freedom and creative expression. War Commander Vix Carr watched in horror as his carefully organized military force dissolved into chaos. His ships were abandoning their posts, his crews were questioning their orders, and some were actually joining the enemy. "This is impossible," he whispered to himself. "A military force cannot function without discipline and order." But the humans had proven that wrong. Their chaotic, undisciplined approach to warfare had somehow infected his own forces with the same chaos. The virus of individual thought was spreading through his fleet, and he had no idea how to stop it. For the first time in his long career, Vix Carr began to understand that the humans hadn't just defeated his ships. They had destroyed his entire understanding of how intelligent beings should behave. And worst of all, he was beginning to think they might be right. The Fourth Draconian Fleet never made it to Earth. Admiral Chris Anderson watched the long-range sensors with amazement as the alien ships stopped moving halfway through their journey. They just sat there in empty space, not attacking, not retreating, just existing. "What are they doing?" asked Captain Tom Baker, commanding one of the human patrol ships. "According to our intercepted communications, they're having meetings," Anderson replied. "Apparently, the ship crews are voting on whether to continue the mission." Baker shook his head in disbelief. "Voting? These are the same aliens who conquered half the galaxy through absolute military discipline? Not anymore, it seems." The truth was even more remarkable than the humans realized. The Draconian fleet had ground to a halt because the crews were experiencing something their species had never known: democracy. Individual ships were holding discussions, debates, and yes, votes on what to do next. Commander Kexler stood before his crew in the ship's main assembly hall, something that had never existed on a Draconian vessel before. In the past, orders came from above and were followed without question. Now, his crew wanted to discuss their options. "The humans have offered us asylum," Kexler said, still struggling with the concept. "They say we can choose our own path, create our own lives. But what does that mean?" asked one of his officers. "How do we choose if we've never had choices before?" It was a question that had no easy answer. The Draconians had lived for centuries under absolute rule, with every aspect of their lives controlled by the state. The idea of personal freedom was both exciting and terrifying. Back on Earth, Dr. Patricia Lewis was working around the clock to help the growing number of Draconian refugees. These former soldiers and citizens were like children learning to walk, struggling to understand basic concepts that humans took for granted. "Tell me about this thing you call friendship," asked Vex, though, a former Draconian officer who had requested asylum after the third battle. "Why do you choose to associate with beings who provide no military or economic advantage?" Patricia smiled patiently. She had been asked this question dozens of times by different refugees. "Because we enjoy their company. Because they make us happy. Because we care about their well-being." "But what do you gain from their happiness?" "We gain happiness too. When our friends are happy, we feel good. When they're sad, we feel sad. were connected to each other in ways that go beyond practical benefits. Vexthol looked puzzled. This makes no logical sense. Yet ... When I watch humans interact, I see something I cannot name. A warmth between them. I find myself wanting to experience this warmth. These conversations were happening all over Earth as more and more Draconians abandoned their fleet to join human society. They were drawn by concepts they couldn't fully understand, but somehow knew they needed to experience. The collapse of the Draconian Empire was accelerating. On worlds that had been conquered centuries ago, local populations were declaring independence. Not through violence, but through the simple act of refusal. Citizens were saying no to orders they disagreed with, something that had never happened before in their recorded history. Supreme War Leader Hexmore stood in his command center, watching his empire crumble on the holographic displays. Red indicators showed system after system falling out of Imperial control. But there were no battles, no explosions, no destroyed cities. People were simply walking away from their assigned duties to pursue their own interests. How do we fight an enemy that doesn't attack? He asked his remaining loyal advisors. How do we conquer a force that spreads through ideas rather than weapons? None of them had an answer. The Draconian military was designed to fight other militaries, not to combat concepts like individual freedom and creative expression. On a distant planet called Zarian, former Draconian citizens were attempting something unprecedented, creating art. Kexmora, who had been a factory supervisor under the old system, was now trying to understand something humans called painting. Why do you put colors on the canvas? She asked her human teacher, a refugee from Earth named Lisa, who had been captured years ago. Because I find it beautiful, Lisa replied. Because it makes me feel peaceful. Because I want to share my vision of the world with others. Kexmora stared at the painting, trying to understand the concept of beauty. In Draconian society, everything had to have a practical purpose. The idea of creating something simply because it was pleasing to look at was revolutionary. But as she picked up the brush and made her first tentative mark on the canvas, she felt something she had never experienced before. A sense of ... satisfaction. Joy? She didn't have words for it, but she wanted to feel it again. Similar scenes were playing out across the former empire. Citizens were discovering music, literature, dance, and dozens of other forms of expression that had been forbidden under the old system. They were learning to think for themselves, to make choices, to be individuals, rather than just parts of a machine. The effect was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Human refugees and escaped prisoners, scattered throughout Draconian space, were becoming teachers and guides for beings who were essentially learning how to be free. Captain Tom Baker led the first official diplomatic mission to the Draconian home world. What he found there shocked him. The planet was in chaos, but it was a strangely peaceful chaos. Citizens were wandering the streets, trying to figure out what to do with their newfound freedom. We need help, admitted Hexmore when he met with the human delegation. Our society is collapsing, but our people aren't dying. They're just ... lost. They don't know how to live without someone telling them what to do. That's normal, Baker replied. Freedom is scary when you've never had it before. But it's also worth it. We can help you learn, if you want us to. The meeting that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. The supreme leader of a vast empire was asking for help from a species they had tried to conquer. Not military help, not economic assistance, but guidance on how to build a society based on individual choice and personal freedom. Dr. Rachel Green, Earth's leading expert on social transformation, was part of the delegation. She had studied the collapse of authoritarian systems throughout human history, but nothing had prepared her for this. The Draconians aren't just changing their government. she explained to the team. They're changing their entire understanding of what it means to be alive. They're discovering consciousness, individuality, creativity. It's like watching an entire species wake up from a 1,000-year sleep. The transformation wasn't without its problems. Some Draconians couldn't handle the concept of freedom and retreated into isolation. Others became obsessed with human culture, trying to copy everything they saw without understanding it. But most were slowly learning to think for themselves, to make their own choices, to create their own meaning in life. Engineer Steve Wilson, analyzing the abandoned Draconian warships, marveled at what had happened. These ships were designed to be indestructible, he said, but they weren't built to handle crews who could think for themselves. When the aliens started questioning orders and making individual decisions, the ships became useless. The mighty Draconian war machine had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by the simple idea that individuals had the right to choose their own path. The Empire's greatest strength, its absolute unity and discipline, had become its greatest weakness when exposed to the concept of personal freedom. As more and more Draconian worlds declared independence, a new question emerged. What would replace the Empire? For the first time in their history, the Draconians would have to decide for themselves what kind of society they wanted to build, and they were asking the humans to help them figure it out. 1 year after the first Draconian fleet had arrived at Earth, the galaxy was a completely different place. Admiral Ben Parker stood on the bridge of the joint human-Draconian exploration ship Unity, watching as former enemies worked side by side to explore unknown regions of space. Navigation. Set course for the Andromeda sector, he ordered. Yes, Admiral, replied Kexthol, the former Draconian officer, who now served as his second in command. The alien had chosen to keep his original name, but had asked to be called Kevin by his human friends. The transformation of the Draconians had been remarkable to witness. Kevin was no longer the rigid, obedient soldier he had been a year ago. He laughed at human jokes, even if he didn't always understand them. He had taken up painting in his spare time, creating abstract works that somehow captured the joy of discovering individual expression. Admiral, reported Communications Officer Danny Lee, we're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Council. They want to know if we can mediate a dispute between the Zephyrians and the Altarians. Ben smiled. The Galactic Council was something that would have been impossible under the old Draconian Empire. It was a voluntary organization of species that had come together to solve problems through discussion rather than conquest. The idea had been proposed by the former Draconians themselves, who were eager to find alternatives to their old ways of domination. Tell them we'll be happy to help, Ben replied. That's what we do now. Back on Earth, Dr. Rachel Green was putting the finishing touches on her book about the transformation of the galaxy. She had spent the year documenting how the collapse of the Draconian Empire had led to the greatest period of peace and prosperity in galactic history. The key insight, she wrote, was that the Draconians weren't evil. They were simply trapped in a system that didn't allow for individual growth or creative expression. When they were exposed to human concepts of freedom and choice, they embraced them eagerly. The former empire had become a confederation of free worlds, each developing its own unique culture and government. Some had chosen democracy, others had experimented with different forms of collective decision-making. A few had even created entirely new types of society that combined the best aspects of order and freedom. Captain Holly Burns commanded the UES Guardian, now part of the joint Earth Draconian fleet. Her crew was half human, half Draconian, and they worked together with an efficiency that amazed both species. Holly, called out Vexmora, her Draconian tactical officer, I've been thinking about something. What's that? A year ago, I was programmed to destroy your ship and kill your crew. Now, I would give my life to protect you. How is such a change possible? Holly considered the question. Because you discovered that we're not so different after all. We both want to be happy, to be free, to be valued for who we are as individuals. The old system didn't allow you to see that. But why did humans see it when we could not? Maybe because we never had a choice. Humans have always been chaotic and unpredictable. We've had to learn to work together despite our differences. You were taught that everyone had to be the same. To get along, we learned that our differences make us stronger. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the bridge. A distress signal had been detected from a remote star system. The signal was coming from a species the humans had never encountered before, under attack by an aggressive alien race. Looks like we have work to do, Holly said. As the Guardian changed course to respond to the emergency, the rescue mission was typical of the new galactic order. The joint human-Draconian fleet arrived to find a peaceful species, under attack by raiders who had learned nothing from the Draconian Empire's fall. This is Admiral Parker of the Galactic Council Fleet, then transmitted to the attacking ships. You will cease your assault immediately and withdraw from this system. The raiders laughed at the transmission. You think we fear your mixed fleet of humans and Draconian traders? We are the Vorlic Empire, and we take what we want. Ben exchanged glances with Kevin. Some species never learn, he said quietly. Perhaps we should teach them, Kevin replied, but his tone was sad rather than angry. A year ago, he would have suggested destroying the raiders outright. Now he hoped for a peaceful solution. The battle that followed was unlike the old days of Draconian conquest. Instead of overwhelming force designed to crush and intimidate, the joint fleet used precision tactics aimed at disabling the raider ships without unnecessary casualties. They had learned that victory was meaningless if it came at the cost of becoming the thing they fought against. The Vorlic ships were quickly overwhelmed, not by superior firepower, but by tactics they couldn't understand. Human creativity combined with Draconian precision created a fighting force that was both unpredictable and effective. Why don't you just destroy us? Asked the captured Vorlock commander when he was brought aboard the Unity. Because destruction doesn't solve anything, Ben replied. We've learned that the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a friend. The Vorlick commander looked confused. That makes no sense. The strong rule the weak. That is the law of the universe. No, said Kevin, stepping forward. That's just one way to live. We've discovered there are better ways. Over the following days, the captured Vorlic crews were exposed to the same cultural transmissions that had transformed the Draconians. They watched human movies, listened to music, saw art created for no purpose other than beauty. They learned about concepts like compassion, friendship, and cooperation, that not all of them were transformed. Some rejected the ideas entirely and chose exile rather than change. But many others began to question their old beliefs, just as the Draconians had done. It's happening again, observed Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who had joined the mission to study the effect of human culture on other species. The ideas are spreading. Freedom and individual expression are like seeds that grow wherever they're planted. Commander Julie Fox, now serving as Earth's ambassador to the growing Galactic Council, watched the transformation with satisfaction. The galaxy was becoming a place where differences were celebrated rather than eliminated, where creativity was valued over conformity. We've received requests for cultural exchange from 16 different species, she reported to the council. Everyone wants to learn about human concepts of individual freedom and creative expression. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was happening on the former Draconian homeworld. The planet that had once been the center of a rigid, oppressive empire was now becoming a hub of artistic and cultural innovation. Former Supreme War Leader Hexmore, who now went by the name Henry, had become an unlikely advocate for democracy and individual rights. He spent his days helping other former Draconians learn to think for themselves to make their own choices, to find their own paths in life. I spent centuries believing that order and control were the highest virtues," he said during a speech to the newly formed Draconian Parliament. "But humans taught us that chaos can be beautiful, that differences make us stronger, that freedom is worth any amount of uncertainty." Engineer Steve Wilson, now director of the Joint Human Draconian Technology Program, marveled at what they had accomplished together. "We're not just building better ships," he explained to his mixed team of human and alien engineers. "We're building a better galaxy." The new ships they designed combined human innovation with draconian precision, creating vessels that were both efficient and adaptable. But more importantly, they were built by crews who worked together because they wanted to, not because they were forced to dot. As the Unity continued its patrol of the Outer Rim, Ben Parker reflected on how much had changed. The galaxy that had once been ruled by fear and oppression was now a place of cooperation and mutual respect. Species that had been enemies were now allies, working together to explore the unknown and protect the innocent. "Sir," reported Danny Lee, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth. President Davis wants to congratulate us on another successful mission." Ben smiled. Ellen Davis had been re-elected by the largest margin in human history, partly because of her role in the transformation of the galaxy. But she always insisted that the real heroes were the ordinary people who had chosen cooperation over conquest, understanding over hatred. "Tell the president that the mission isn't over yet," Ben replied. "As long as there are species in the galaxy who haven't discovered the power of individual freedom and creative expression, we have work to do." The Unity set course for its next destination, carrying with it the most powerful weapon humanity had ever created: the simple idea that every individual, regardless of species or origin, had the right to choose their own path in life. The Draconian fleet had come to Earth expecting to find another primitive species to conquer. Instead, they had discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that strength came not from uniformity and control, but from diversity and freedom. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would the species who had learned that. Sometimes the greatest victory was helping your enemy discover who they truly wanted to be.